Welcome to our first Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Book Club meeting. And of course, our first book this year was The Color of Law. And we're so excited to be joined by the authors. And the reason that this book club was created is for us to explore topics of importance to our real estate community in reference to DEI and fair housing, and to have a place to have conversations about these things, and also virtual to make it so that we're all over the state, but still getting the opportunity to be here with each other today on Zoom. And of course, I would like to shout out our chair of the Diversity Council this year, Denise Franklin, and our co-chair, Richard Trappier, who have been working really hard to get this out and to make sure people have books and to promote. So super thankful to have both of them on the call today. And of course, as you know, or if you don't know, we actually were recognized last year by Arello for a Fair Housing Award for our work in this space. And that was before the book club. So maybe we can put this on there and try to get that award again this year. So this is just one of our many initiatives to highlight important conversations, to stay focused on DEI, not just in April, which is Fair Housing Month, but all year round. But we wanted to bring this especially to you guys in April in celebration of Fair Housing Month. We also are proud to announce that we received a NAR Fair Housing Grant to be able to contribute to the book club and some of the fees associated with being able to bring the author and purchase books and things like that. So we are super excited about utilizing funding from NAR, who has invested into diversity and fair housing. And we want to make sure that we're using all of the tools that we can to further our mission here at South Carolina Realtors. And with that, I'm going to introduce our authors here today. First, we have Lee Rothstein, who is the co-author to a sequel of The Color of Law called Just Action, which they'll actually be discussing with you guys today. And that will be released this summer in June. So Lee is, while The Color of Law really focuses on housing discrimination in our country, the sequel will describe how local community groups can redress segregation and really be a part of the change. So I felt it was timely and a nice follow-up for us to be able to not only hear about the history, hear about the problems, but now it's a book coming out to tell us what to do, which is often a question that I get. Well, you know, we know the problems, but where do we go from here? So that is super exciting that they'll be sharing that. Lee has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots all the way up to government levels. She has been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities, counties, and private firms on community development and affordable housing policy. Lee received her bachelor's degree with honors in American Studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and her master's degree in public policy from the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. And I'd just like to thank you for being here, Lee. And our other author is Richard Rothstein, which is actually Lee's father. And he is a Harvard alum, as well as a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute. He's also a senior fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Along with writing The Color of the Law, Mr. Rothstein lectures widely about issues on equity, segregation, race, and education. And I would like to thank you also for being here. And the format of the meeting today is going to be presentations from the author for about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by questions. So this is a chance for our members to talk directly to experts in this field and to get your questions answered. So, you know, we have 20 to 30 minutes set aside just for those conversations and communication. So, you know, be thinking of your questions as they present their presentation. And without further ado, I will hand it over to both of you guys as the authors. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Tiara, Denise, and all of you. Thanks for being here today. And I'm gratified that you read The Color of Law, and I hope you found it valuable. I'll spend a little bit of time summarizing it, refresh your recollection of what you read before turning it over to Leah. We all grew up, I did, with the notion that this country has something called de facto segregation. It's a term we all used. I used it. I'm sure you did as well. De facto segregation means that the way in which this country came to be segregated was by purely private activity. The actions primarily of real estate agents, private businesses, developers, banks, private homeowners who wouldn't sell or rent homes to African Americans, businesses of all kinds that discriminated. That's what we call de facto segregation. We also think maybe it happened because people just like to live with each other, the same race. It's all self-choice. Or maybe it's all because of income differences. Most African Americans, on average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, and many can't afford to buy homes in more expensive white middle-class neighborhoods. All of these individual, personal, bigoted, self-choice factors is what's created segregation. And we tell ourselves that what happened by accident can only unhappened by accident, can only end by accident. And we don't have much hope of that happening. We've accepted racial segregation, residential segregation as an immutable fact of life. Well, the book, The Color of Law, as you know, demolished that myth of de facto segregation. There is no such thing in this country. The segregation that we have in every metropolitan area in South Carolina and every other state in the country, north and south, was the deliberate, purposeful creation of government with explicit policies that ensured that Blacks and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area. It's an unconstitutional system because these actions of government violated the 13th, 14th Amendments to the Constitution and 5th Amendment to the Constitution. It's an unconstitutional system of segregation. And because it's unconstitutional, we have an obligation as Americans, all of us, to do something to undo it. We cannot really hold our heads up as American citizens if we don't do something to redress unconstitutional actions that the government took. Well, I spent much of my career writing about education policy, and I came to this topic of the demolition of the notion of de facto segregation when in 2007 I read a Supreme Court decision that prohibited two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, from enacting very, very token school desegregation plans. Those cities both enacted a plan that permitted parents to choose which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice that they made was going to intensify segregation, it wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a parent who wouldn't do that. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, a Black and a white child applied for the last remaining place or one of the last remaining places, the Black child would be given some preference, help to desegregate the school. So it's a trivial program. You don't have one or a couple of places left very often. You have to choose between Black and white applicants for them. But the Supreme Court denounced this program. They said you couldn't do such a thing. They said that this was unconstitutional, this kind of integration plan, desegregation plan. And Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion, and he explained that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated, but he said they were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated. Well, that was true. It was a wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. But then he went on to explain in this decision that the neighborhoods were segregated de facto because of private bigotry and the actions of private businesses, of the real estate industry and the banking industry and developers. And he said, well, you have private actions that created segregation. It's a violation of the Constitution to do anything to fix it. Well, I read this decision and I was shocked because I remembered reading about something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the two districts that this decision concerned. And some years before, there was a white homeowner in an all-white suburb of Louisville called Shively. Single-family homes, all white. That white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. He was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and child, wanted to buy a single-family home, but no real estate agent would sell him one. So the white homeowner then bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend, frequently throughout the country. That was the only way that African-Americans could ever move to middle-class neighborhoods, if there was a so-called straw buyer who would buy a home for them and then resell it to them, evading the real estate industry in that way. When this family moved in to the home that the white homeowner had bought for them in the suburb of Shively, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop any of this. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a Black family. I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. The police, the prosecutors, the courts, they're all agents of government. They work for the government. This is a blatant 14th Amendment violation. I began to look into it further, and I found that there were hundreds and hundreds of cases, and I'm not exaggerating here, of police protected, sometimes even police organized and led, mob violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in previously all-white neighborhoods. Every one of these hundreds and hundreds of cases was a constitutional violation and has never been remedied. I then began to look into that further and found that state-sponsored violence wasn't the only way in which the government created segregation. There were many, many other federal, state, and local policies, racially explicit, as I said, designed to ensure that Blacks and whites could not live in the same neighborhoods anywhere. Let me describe just one or two of them in the brief time that we have together. I know you've read about this before. Perhaps the most powerful policy that the federal government implemented was a policy of the Federal Housing Administration in the post-World War II period to suburbanize the entire white population that was previously living in urban areas. We were a manufacturing economy at the time. Factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals so they could get their parts or ship their final products. The banks and the other service industries that service these factories also had to be located in those downtown areas. So downtowns had Blacks and whites living together, sometimes even in non-segregated neighborhoods, not always, but sometimes. The federal government began a program, the Federal Housing Administration, to move only the whites out of those downtown areas into single-family homes in new suburbs that the Federal Housing Administration was creating. This was a racially explicit policy. The federal government had a policy manual that said, it was a manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to evaluate the applications of developers for these new suburbs to get federal bank guarantees for their loans. The manual said that you could not recommend a federal bank guarantee for a developer who is going to sell to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a developer of an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. And this was written. This notion of de facto segregation was utter nonsense. Well, the most famous of these policies, as perhaps you recall, was Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place, one area east of New York. Banks wouldn't lend Levitt the money to build this project. They thought it was a crazy idea. We were in a suburban country at that time. The only people living in suburbs were affluent people. As I said, even whites were living in urban areas. The only way that Levitt could build this project was by going to the Federal Housing and Veterans Administrations, submitting his plans for the development, the architectural style, the materials he's going to use, and a required commitment that he never sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even recommended that Levitt place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And with these agreements, Levitt was able to get the bank loans guaranteed by the federal government to build this project. It was a federally subsidized project. And this was true of suburbs all over the country. Any suburb in South Carolina or anywhere else that was built in the New Deal post-war period was unconstitutionally created by the federal government as a whites-only place. The homes were very inexpensive. They cost, in today's money, about $100,000. Those homes were easily affordable to African Americans and whites who had jobs in the post-war economy. $100,000, as you know, is only about twice national median income. Anybody with a job, doesn't have to be a great job, a working class job, can afford a home at that price. Today, though, those homes are no longer worth only $100,000. They cost $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some parts of the country, $1 million or more. The white families who were subsidized to purchase these homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the appreciation of the value of those homes over the next couple of generations. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They use it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies, maybe a medical emergency or maybe a short-term unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this program that wound up generating great wealth for white working class and then became middle class families. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story behind that too. I don't have time to go into that now, but you'd think that if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. After all, you can save the same amount of money from the same amount of income. But in reality, while African American incomes are 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is only about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and that we've never remedied, and that we, all of us, have never accepted the obligation to remedy because it is a constitutional violation. Well, the wealth gap, that between that 5% and wealth ratio and 60% income ratio, that wealth gap underlies the most serious social problems we have in this country. It, of course, is responsible because African Americans today and subsequent generations don't have inherited wealth for down payments. It's responsible for the continued segregation of African Americans in lower income neighborhoods. It's responsible for health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have more exposure to polluted areas, greater rates of cardiovascular disease. It's responsible for differences in school achievement between Black children and white children, primarily because Black children come to school with so many social and economic disadvantages that result from their being locked into neighborhoods that don't have the kinds of resources that white families have. Well, there were many, many other federal, state, and local policies. I've described some of them in The Color of Law, not all. The book would have been much too long for even devoted readers like you if I had described them all, but many policies that created this unconstitutional segregation. People read that book, and it was published in 2017. And increasingly, they asked me, okay, it's an unconstitutional system. What can we do about it? And I told them, well, there's no political support now for significant federal policy to undo the racial segregation that the federal and local and state governments created. But there's lots that people can do in their local communities, people like you, to redress racial segregation. I recruited my daughter, Leah Rothstein, who knows much more about housing policy than I do, to co-author a new book about what we can do about it. It's called Just Action. I'll put the link to it, to the page in the chat. It'll be published on June 1st. And I'll turn this over now to Leah to talk about some of the policies and programs that you and others in your local communities can pursue to redress the unconstitutional segregation that characterizes this entire society.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for having us. So as Richard mentioned, a lot of people ask, myself included, what do we do about this now? And as he started to describe in our new book, we described that in order to redress segregation, the segregation of our communities, we need to start to take action locally. And there's a lot that can be done locally. We understand that federal policy change will be necessary eventually for the massive interventions and investments that are needed to truly redress and challenge segregation on a national level. But we don't have the political support on the national level now. But we can build that political support locally in our own communities. And there's a lot that we can accomplish there once we start working on this. So to do that, we need to start to build a new activist civil rights movement across the country, beginning locally in our own communities. And how do we start to do that? Well, it might seem daunting to begin a national civil rights movement, but we can begin, locally with our own neighbors by building biracial, multi-ethnic groups and committees to start to work on these issues. Now that itself might seem daunting because we these days have little cross-race social contact. We have little social contact with people of other races outside of where we work in our workplaces, due in large part because we live in segregated communities. But it's not impossible. In Just Action, in our book, we described examples of communities that are very racially segregated, and people have lived in these communities their whole lives and never really known people of other races and never known much about the neighborhoods that they don't live in, the other race neighborhoods in their cities. And they developed ways of meeting people from different parts of their city, from different races, and developing sort of social networks and groups to start to come together and address issues in their cities and start to learn about their city's history. So it might be daunting, it might seem hard, but it's not impossible. Many of these groups that we describe in Just Action and other groups around the country start forming and talking to each other about issues of segregation by learning about their own community's history and the history of the country, much like you're doing, reading Color of Law. So in some communities, we discuss Modesto, California, Rochester, New York, Charlottesville, Virginia. Groups there they all started working on these issues when homeowners there discovered racially restrictive covenants on the deeds of their own homes. So these racially restrictive covenants are a primary tool. They were a primary tool of the federal government to create segregation in the 20th century. You read about them probably in the Color of Law. They're the covenants that come on the deeds of the home that say the home can only ever be owned or occupied by whites. So these racially restrictive covenants are no longer legally enforceable, but they remain on deeds forever. They're like the property lines, they're the legal part of the legal document of that home. And so some of residents of these communities discovered these racially restrictive covenants on their own homes, and they were shocked to learn how intentionally and explicitly their own neighborhood and their own home was racially segregated. And they started looking around their own cities and researching where these covenants existed. They've started creating inventories and maps and overlaid those maps of where the restrictive covenants were with the current racial makeup of their cities, and found they track very closely, not surprisingly. And they created educational campaigns and started teaching their neighborhoods and communities about how segregation was created in their own areas. And through this, they started to raise awareness and inspire action. Because once we see how intentionally segregation was created, that it took intentional action to create it, it wasn't an accident, like Richard said earlier, we can see that intentional actions can do something to challenge it. So we describe in our book dozens of policies and strategies that a group can take on and pursue once it's formed to start to redress segregation. And these strategies are two-pronged. They're both forward-looking. We have to make sure that we're not continuing to create and maintain segregation moving forward in our communities. And they're also past looking. We need to right the wrongs of the past and remedy the harms that have been created by the segregation that our government helped to create in our communities. So we can't sort of just go forward and expect equity without addressing the disparities that exist, like the wealth gap that Richard talked about as a result of our segregated communities. So these strategies and policies we talk about not only are two-pronged, but they fit into two main categories. The first category are strategies that are concerned with increasing investment in lower income segregated communities, where the concentration of poverty is the direct result of government-sponsored segregation. So these strategies also include anti-displacement strategies, because often once we begin to increase resources in lower income communities, those communities become more desirable to people with higher incomes. They can then threaten to displace the lower income residents who've lived there for a long time. We sometimes call this gentrification. So as the community starts to be better resourced, the people who've lived there for a long time can be forced out, be priced out of that community. So we need strategies to ensure that they can stay there to enjoy the increased resources as they start to be built. So those anti-displacement and strategies include things like rent control to sort of limit the rapidly increasing rents that happens in gentrifying communities, just cause eviction ordinances that protect renters from unjust evictions, and inclusionary zoning policies, which are a policy that a city can pass that say when new market rate developments occur in a neighborhood, that a certain percent of the units have to be reserved to be sold or rented to lower and moderate income families. So one strategy I'm going to talk about that has to do with increasing investments and resources in lower income communities and preventing displacement is starting or expanding a land trust. So there's over 200 communities across the country that have a land trust. And what a land trust does is it intends to maintain affordable housing in perpetuity in a neighborhood where prices are starting to rise, and maybe a community is gentrifying, the prices are going up, and a land trust will attempt to create permanently affordable housing in that neighborhood. At the same time, it also can provide affordable homeownership opportunities for lower and moderate income families in that neighborhood. And those are two big goals. And a land trust can achieve both of those first, it has to acquire property in that neighborhood. It often does this through local government donating vacant or unused land to a land trust, or homes that are vacant, it can donate those to a land trust. And a local government will do this if it has a local group advocating that the government use the vacant land in the city that way. So this is a way that a group organized to redress segregation could have an impact by advocating that their local government donate vacant land to a land trust. So the land trust will then get this land and it will either build or rehabilitate the home on that land, and then it will sell it at an affordable price to a lower or moderate income family. And this family is a family that can afford the monthly mortgage payments, but maybe doesn't have the wealth for a down payment, and maybe can't afford the rising housing costs in their neighborhood as the prices are increasing. So that family owns the home like any other homeowner family. They pay their mortgage, taxes, insurance. But the way that the home price is kept affordable is that when the land trust sells the family the home, it retains ownership of the land underneath the house. So the increasing price of land, the rapidly increasing price of land, is one of the primary drivers of the increasing unaffordability of housing. So by taking the land out of the equation, the land trust can ensure that the home is sold at a more affordable price. The land trust then retains ownership of the land. The family maybe leases the land from the land trust for some negligible amount, like $1 a year. And in return, the family agrees that when it comes time to resell the home, when that family wants to move on and sell the home, it has to adhere to a formula that the land trust establishes that tells it what the maximum resale price of that home can be. And that maximum resale price is, every land trust sort of makes that formula slightly differently, but they all try to achieve, balance these two goals of keeping the resale price affordable for the next home buying family, while also allowing the home selling family to earn some equity in the sale. So that family, the home selling family, won't earn as much equity as if they sold it at a market rate price, but they got into the home at an affordable price. And so when they resell it, they'll resell it again at an affordable price. And in that way, the land trust can retain affordable home prices forever for their portfolio of homes. So an example we talk about in Just Action is in Durham, North Carolina. There's a land trust there, the Durham Land Trust. It was started when a group of residents of a lower income, predominantly African-American neighborhood started to talk to each other and talk about what they could do to improve their neighborhood. And they started by deciding they wanted to get a park built in their community. There were no parks, there were no safe places for children to play. They were playing in the streets, and a child had gotten hit by a car. And so the community wanted to do something about this. So they advocated that the city turn a vacant lot in their neighborhood into a park. And they won. They got the park, and the group was galvanized and excited and started to talk about what else they could do to help their neighborhood. Now, at the time, their neighborhood was gentrifying. This was a neighborhood that was near Duke University, and the university was expanding enrollment, and investors saw an opportunity and were buying up houses in this lower income community near the university and selling or renting them to the Duke University community and displacing residents of that neighborhood. So this group wanted to do something to prevent that displacement. So they learned about a land trust and they started one. They started with 2 vacant homes, which they sold to lower and moderate income families for about $100,000 in today's money, which was pretty affordable. The homes in their portfolio now sell for about $150,000, and that's because that equation I talked about for the formula for determining the maximum resale price, it bumps the price up a little bit so the home sellers can earn some equity. So they're slightly less affordable now, $150,000 versus $100,000. But other homes in the neighborhood today sell for $500,000. So they've really retained affordability in their stock of housing in that neighborhood. So it's also been an effective anti-displacement strategy in that neighborhood. The blocks in that community where the land trust has been able to acquire and sell homes, most of the residents are still African-American. And in surrounding blocks in that neighborhood where investors outpace the land trust, most of the residents are now white. So we can see that a land trust can both be an effective anti-displacement strategy and an effective strategy for creating long-term affordable housing home ownership opportunities in communities as their prices rise. So what can we do with this example? Well, individually, we can donate or volunteer if there's a land trust in our community or help to get one started. But more importantly is what we can do collectively together as residents of our communities, which is join or support a campaign to either start or fund a land trust by advocating that a local government and local institutions help support a land trust by ensuring it has the resources it needs to continue to acquire land and create more home ownership opportunities. And one way to do that is to research the institutions in your neighborhoods that were responsible for the racial segregation of the community. One way to do that is by looking at the restrictive covenants that I discussed earlier that are on the deeds of homes. And on those covenants and the deeds, often the original bank that financed the building of the home, the original developer, the original realtor, the builder of the home are listed on those deeds and on the covenants. And if those companies aren't still in existence, which many of them are, they have successor companies that have bought up the older company and assumed the profits and the obligations of those past companies. And those obligations include doing something to remedy the segregation that those companies helped to create. One way to do that would be to support a land trust in that community to help support these goals of increasing home ownership for African-American families and preventing displacement in their neighborhoods. So that's an example of a strategy that can help increase investment in lower income segregated communities and prevent displacement there as investment increases. The other category of strategies we talk about are strategies that are concerned with opening up exclusive white neighborhoods to diverse residents. So these include strategies like zoning changes to allow more housing diversity in the neighborhood, subsidies for African Americans to move into those neighborhoods. Also, inclusionary zoning is a policy that works for this category of strategies as well. And building housing that's affordable to lower and moderate income households in these exclusive, usually expensive white neighborhoods. This category of strategies also includes those that protect the integration of these neighborhoods as they start to diversify, to prevent white flight and to prevent the neighborhood from them flipping from segregated all white to segregated all African American, and to maintain an integrated, diverse neighborhood as that happens. So one example of a strategy that falls into this category has to do with Section 8 housing choice vouchers. Many of you have probably heard of this program. It's the largest federal rental subsidy program in the country. These are housing vouchers given to lower income families. It's administered by local public housing authorities and funded by the federal government. Over 2 million low-income households who are disproportionately African American receive housing choice or Section 8 vouchers across the country. There's another 8 million low-income households who are eligible for vouchers and are on waiting lists or don't even bother to get on the waiting list, and that's because the program is underfunded. That's another issue for another talk, but 2 million households is a lot for this program to help. And these 2 million households get a housing voucher that allows them to rent a unit in the private market. So unlike public housing, where public housing residents benefit comes tied to a unit or a place in a building, for voucher recipients, their voucher allows them to use that voucher anywhere in the jurisdiction and sometimes outside of the housing authority's jurisdiction to rent a unit from private landlords. Now, most of us want to live in neighborhoods with low crime, with well-resourced schools and open space, access to jobs and transportation to get to them. We call these areas of high opportunity. And children who grow up in these areas, they do better. They have better educational outcomes, health and income outcomes. Their parents have less stress and depression. And these high opportunity communities are often designed to keep lower income people out. Zoning, for example, by ensuring that these communities can only have single family homes built in them, that ensures that the house prices in those communities remain high and lower income families can't afford to live there. So Section 8 has the potential and had the intention when it was created to address this and allow lower income families to move out of lower income communities by using their voucher to rent in other higher opportunity communities. But only 5% of Section 8 voucher holders live in these high opportunity communities, and white voucher holders are more likely to than African American voucher holders. And one reason for this is discrimination, plain and simple. Discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders is a legal form of discrimination. Per the federal government, it is legal to discriminate against someone who uses Section 8 to pay their rent. Many states and localities have outlawed this type of discrimination, but using a law called the Source of Income Discrimination Law, saying it's illegal to discriminate against a tenant because they use Section 8 to pay their rent. There are no cities or localities in South Carolina that have these source of income discrimination laws, but a local group organized to redress segregation and take on these issues can organize to advocate for a source of income discrimination law to be passed locally. And that would help prevent discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. But even places where a law is in effect, discrimination still happens often. And that's because passing a law is just the first step. Once we have the law, we then need education and monitoring and enforcement of the law to ensure that discrimination doesn't occur. And where this work usually falls, this education, monitoring, and enforcement of anti-discrimination laws usually falls to fair housing organizations, excuse me, to do this work. And those fair housing organizations need our support. So a group organized to redress segregation could also advocate that their local government and local institutions support their local fair housing organizations to ensure that this type of discrimination doesn't occur. We can also individually volunteer as testers with a fair housing organization. And this is when individuals who pose as potential tenants, some white, some African American, they say they have the same sort of financial background and credentials. Some will say they use Section 8, and some will say they don't. And they see how they're treated and who's offered a unit from landlords. And that is how we can start to see where discrimination is occurring and then can address it and enforce anti-discrimination laws. But fair housing organizations need volunteers to do these tests, and that's another place we can contribute to these remedies and to challenging segregation. So aside from discrimination, the way the voucher program is set up also is an obstacle to voucher holders moving to higher opportunity communities. So how a voucher works is when a family gets a Section 8 voucher, they pay 30% of their monthly income towards their rent, and the voucher makes up the difference, up to a maximum voucher amount that's determined by HUD and local public housing organizations, public housing agencies. And that maximum voucher amount is based on the median rent of an entire metropolitan area. So you take all of the rents of a metro area from the lowest to the highest, you take the middle rent, go 10% below that, and that's the maximum amount that a voucher will support in that entire metropolitan area. So by definition, over half of the metropolitan area's rents are too expensive for voucher holders to afford. Not surprisingly, those are the rents in the higher opportunity areas, so those voucher holders can't afford to move to those areas. Now, in 2010, there was a lawsuit in Dallas about this issue. It alleged that this voucher payment standard caused the segregation and isolation of African American and Hispanic voucher holders into high poverty areas. And as a result of this lawsuit, the housing authorities in the Dallas area adopted a different payment standard where the maximum rent a voucher will pay is based on a smaller area. So a zip code or a group of zip codes, you take the median rent in that smaller area, and that's the maximum rent a voucher will pay in that small area. So in higher cost areas, a voucher will pay more than in lower cost areas. And that makes sense, and it worked, and it allowed voucher holders to have more mobility out of high poverty areas. And as a result, now there are 180 public housing authorities in 24 metropolitan areas that are required to use this small area fair market rent standard. One of them is the Charlotte, Gastonia, Rock Hill metro area. And others outside of those 24 metropolitan areas can volunteer to voluntarily adopt these small area rent standards, and some do that. So a local group organized to redress segregation and take on these issues can advocate that their local housing authority adopt these small area rents. And that would go a long way to allowing voucher holders to move out of high poverty areas. So even in places where the small area rents are in place and where discrimination is outlawed, voucher holders still have a hard time making moves to high opportunity areas. So some localities have started mobility programs to support these kinds of moves. They have comprehensive services for the voucher holders, counselors that provide them with assistance in looking for units in high opportunity areas, and transportation to look at them and help them apply. They have staff devoted to recruiting landlords in these areas to agree to be open to renting to Section 8 tenants. And they provide financial assistance to the Section 8 voucher holders to help them pay for higher security deposits and rental application fees and moving expenses. So it has all of these sort of services involved to support mobility moves. We've been following a program in Milwaukee that has all of these components. It has funding from a foundation and a social research firm studying the outcomes. But in the Milwaukee area, they don't use the small area rents in the whole metropolitan area. They just use it in a couple of zip codes. There's an anti-discrimination law just in the city of Milwaukee, but not in the surrounding suburbs. So the participants in this program still can't find units they can afford or landlords who will rent to them in these high opportunity areas. So this is an example of where an organized group can really have an impact by helping to get a small area rent standard adopted in the whole metropolitan area and passing anti-discrimination laws in those suburbs around Milwaukee. So that's an example of a strategy that is concerned with opening up exclusive, expensive, whiter communities to more diverse residents. And I'm going to go back for 1 minute before I wrap up to the land trust example. And I talked about that example as one that can be used to increase investments in lower income communities. And that's because land trusts are often used in lower income communities because that's where they can afford to acquire land. But if a land trust could afford to acquire land in an expensive suburb, it would be an excellent strategy for creating affordable home ownership opportunities in those areas for residents who've been historically, or for people who've been historically excluded from those areas. And the way that can happen is if those suburban local governments donate their vacant land to a land trust. There's plenty of opportunity for this. There's suburbs around the country that have vacant schools because public school enrollment is down, or other vacant land that they can donate to a land trust to create affordable homeownership opportunities in these expensive suburbs and create opportunities for allowing African-American families who've been excluded from these areas to live there. So those are the two main categories of strategies we talk about. We also talk about some strategies that span both of these category goals. And those include things that are attempting to increase home ownership opportunities for African-American homebuyers through down payment assistance, home ownership counseling, and education and subsidies for buying homes. Now, one example in this category is addressing a way that African-Americans are denied home ownership now in a sort of more covert, less obvious way than the racially restrictive covenants I talked about before. And that is the credit scoring system. So we all know about credit scores. They're supposed to be an objective rating of our future likelihood of repaying a mortgage based on our past financial history. And that makes sense. You know, if our past financial history shows that we've defaulted on loans, we're less likely to get a loan in the future. That makes some sense. But the credit score system doesn't take into account all types of financial history. It takes into account the type of financial history that whites are more likely to have than African Americans, such as previous mortgage payments. But if someone has been a renter their whole life, which African Americans are more likely to have been renters their whole lives than whites when applying for a mortgage. Say you've been a renter your whole life and never missed a rent payment, never missed a utility bill payment. None of this financial history is factored into a credit score. And so you're less likely to get a high credit score and get a favorable mortgage based on that credit score. So there's no reason, aside from it being slightly more work, that banks and credit scoring companies can't take into account rental payment history to help African Americans have higher credit scores and have access to more mortgages. There's movement nationally to change the credit scoring systems to factor in rent payment histories. But as we're waiting for that to happen nationally, we can work on this locally by working with our local banks and credit unions to start to factor in rent payment history and utility bill payment history in their own algorithms for credit scoring. There's banks that do this, that individual local branches have started to do this locally, and it's a very effective way of increasing home ownership opportunities for African Americans who've been shut out due to lack of access to mortgage products because of their lack of credit in the traditional credit scoring system. So those are a couple of strategies that we talk about in Just Action. There's dozens more in the book and many, many more we couldn't include in the book. And this is just to give you an idea of what can be done to begin to redress segregation in our own communities. If there's one takeaway I hope you get today from our talk and hopefully from reading our book, if you do, is that there's nothing we can do, that the residential racial segregation of our country is entrenched. It's a system we've come to be used to, but it doesn't have to be that way. And there's not a lack of options and opportunities for us to begin to challenge and redress it. And we just need to get started somewhere. So with that, I will wrap up and turn it over to questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation, both of you. And we have one question from Jerry Ann, who I'm going to turn it over to so she can ask you more about the land trust.
Thank you, Tara. This is a very great conversation. I'm so excited to join you all today. And I have a question. I worked with I'm in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and our local housing authority set up a committee on affordable housing about 3 years ago. And we looked at creating a land trust. And one of the issues, we had several issues, but one of the main issues that we had was communicating to our local community, especially the African American community, how the land trust would empower or create more opportunities for affordable housing. And one of the issues that we faced was that our local government staff and our mayor headed up the issue, but the same government that we were saying we wanted them to donate their land for the land trust created the policies to begin with. And we found that a lot of the land was owned by elderly individuals, 70, 80, and we actually went door to door doing some knocking and trying to communicate it. But the issue that we faced, and what I'm asking your suggestions for, was that they said, hey, we don't trust the local government. This is why we're in this position. So why would we donate our land or start the land trust when they put us in this position to begin with? And we even had of Durham, North Carolina. We sat through several presentations where Duke University supported their land trust. So we asked our local university, which is Winthrop, to donate land. We talked to the school system. So all great examples, but we found difficulty in getting it off the ground. So what are your suggestions in creating trust or building trust within the community to make that happen?
You want to start?
Whatever. Let me just start briefly as saying, and then Leah can do more. As Leah began by saying, the first step has to be to create a popular movement. It can't be done just by policy ideas or local government committees. We need political support in the local community to do these kinds of things. And as Leah described, the committees have to be biracial because African Americans don't have sufficient political power to enact these kinds of things on their own. It needs white support. And there's lots of potential for white support that is untapped. 20 million Americans participated in Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 2020. Most of the participants were white. Many of them were in suburban communities. They then went home and put signs on their lawns about Black Lives Matter and had done nothing since. And those people need to be mobilized to support programs like the land trust that you favor.
Yeah, and
That's
I'd
a great
add
response. Thank you.
a couple of thoughts, and that is many land trusts are actually formed as nonprofits, and they have local government support, but they aren't an arm of the local government. And that might be a way to build trust that isn't asking people to trust in the local government first, maybe. And another thought would be that a land trust could start with land that the local government owns and donates for this purpose, rather than starting with asking people to donate their own land, and to build trust that way and establish a system, a organization that works, that people can see is trustworthy before they're asked to donate their own personal land to the land trust.
I actually like that idea because it's government using the first example, the first donation to get it kicked off. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
And I'll add one other thing. There's lots of unused land that local government has. It can easily be donated.
Mm-hmm.
So we also have a question about what are some good events that people that we can do locally, like diversity, fair housing related, to help the public and our realtors.
Well, dare I say examples, events like this one, but for the broader public, not simply just for realtors.
Yeah, we've talked with groups around the country who've started, book clubs around the color of law, and then created presentations that were specific to their own community about how their own community became segregated and who was behind it and what the sort of results have been and the long-term impacts. They've brought this sort of training or workshop around the community to school districts, to businesses, to neighborhood groups. Another group in Rochester, New York, created a curriculum for their high school and middle schools around segregation. So starting to educate the community by not just the broader ideas, but the specific information about your own cities and communities helps people get involved and interested.
This is Valerie Frazier. I have a statement, really. A question. I'm wondering how we can really move past this particular political mindset that will accept these ideas. What you all have relayed to us or helped us to understand are things that I didn't know. And when I teach real estate classes and I share these ideas, sometimes I get pushback. They don't want to hear this. How dare I? That sort of thing. We don't have enough awareness that this is a problem, that established communities have covenants and restrictions in their bylaws. And if it doesn't pertain to you, you may not realize it. You've read all of them, all those words, you just, skim over them, you sign your deed and you get your house. And people do not realize that these things still exist. How do we, get past this? And I understand through the community, we've got to do more because the law is not taking account for this.
Yeah, that's why it's up to us now, right, in our own communities. And that's why I think the color of law had such an impact, is that you can't argue with the facts of history. And so when people say, I don't want to hear about this isn't real, it's not true, the facts are laid out in that book. They can be laid out by showing the deeds, the restrictive covenants in your own communities, tracing back the companies that were responsible for it. It's harder to argue with that. And people might still push back because they don't want to hear about it. They don't want to face this history. But that's the first step. Once we see this history and see how intentionally it was created, then we can start to see that we have an obligation to do something about it. But we have to start by learning about it and persisting, I think, in talking about it even when there is resistance. Do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I'll just say this. You're in South Carolina, across the South in particular, but elsewhere in the country as well. Governors and legislators are trying to prohibit the teaching of this history. But they wouldn't be trying to prohibit it if people weren't teaching it. When I was in school, and looking at those of you whose pictures are shown, before any of you were born, none of this history was taught. Nobody had to prohibit it because it wasn't being taught. Now they're trying to prohibit it because there are teachers teaching it, and those teachers should be supported in the work that they're doing. So what Leah described a minute ago about helping them with curricular ideas and materials, that's something that can be done to raise awareness in the next generation about this history.
Thank you. And I will go to Jean, who has her hand up, one of our A's.
Yeah. Thank you for this. And Leah, I look forward to reading your book. But I do have a comment on what you're talking about with the land trust. We have found one of our neighboring towns here in Bluffton literally had land ready to give to anyone willing to make a possibility for affordable housing. And what the struggle was, it's not just the land, it's all the other things that come down with it, putting all the utilities in, putting all of the infrastructure in, putting all of those things are almost prohibitable to creating these type of affordable housing. So the land, we can give the land, but unless we change the other ordinances and the other restrictions that keep people behind in being able to move forward with these, it's more than just the land. And I think that has to be discussed too. It has to be, the qualified tax laws that get credits, those are getting prohibitable. These things were written so long ago that that's not the way the world works these days. And I think those all have to be part of this discussion too.
Definitely. Yeah, there's several laws and policies and regulations that make building housing anywhere prohibitively expensive. And that's why we're in the situation we are nationwide, where there's a lack of housing that's affordable to most people.
Correct.
And there's a lot that local government can do to reduce fees and ease up restrictions for housing that's built, that's intended to be affordable, or that has affordable restrictions on the deeds. They can reduce parking requirements, reduce setbacks, reduce permitting fees, all things that sort of not only make the building less expensive, but also maximize the potential for building more units or bigger units that can then bring in a little bit more in the sales prices. So those are all definitely strategies that have to go along with this. Also, you mentioned Bluffton. We mentioned Bluffton in Just Action as a community that has an inclusionary housing ordinance. And that's another way of creating affordable housing that the cost is borne by the developer of that housing, because when a market rate developer proposes to build a project with X number of market rate units, the zoning policy requires them to set aside 10 or 20% of their units as affordable. And so that developer is paying for those units, that the cost of that affordability is built into the cost of the whole development. So that's a way of sort of spreading the costs out and creating affordable housing with a different sort of cost being borne differently.
Unfortunately, though, for Bluffton, most of those developments have already been under, have already set all of their, the planned unit developments. So unless they change those, I don't believe that they're going to be required to put in that inclusionary zoning, which has been, kind of, they almost are, a little late to the party to put that in, but I will tell you, the town of Hilton Head Island just did a Gullah Geechee ordinance, which you might be interested in, which is kind of protecting their land, what they can do with it, adding more density into their land that they're allowed to have, including some businesses that they're allowed now to have on their land that they weren't allowed to have before. So it was a little bit of movement in that in regards to our Gullah Geechee community here on Hilton Head Island. So step, but we certainly have a long ways to go for sure. My other quick comment here, and I'm sorry, this is very interesting. My other quick comment is, where do we hold landlords accountable in this?
Well,
I mean, there's a lot of landlords that take these properties, get these rents, and then don't maintain the properties.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Having code enforcement policies that are effective, that ensure that landlords are maintaining their properties and up to code. Also ensuring that landlords aren't, jacking up rents to force out lower income tenants when they can see the promise of getting higher income tenants in, is also another important piece of this. Enforcing anti-discrimination laws includes landlords, and that's where landlords can be tested for their discrimination. All very important work and all piece of the puzzle. A lot of times, a lot of these policies come along with increased code enforcement policies and practices, because what will happen is, as a community gentrifies and there's promise of getting higher paid tenants, the landlord will let their units sort of go into disrepair so that the people will leave, and then they can get higher income tenants in. So ensuring that units are kept up to code is very important.
Right, exactly. And their appliances, we just had a situation here where there was one area that was it was terrible. Their stoves weren't working, their refrigerators barely worked. I mean, it was just, like, landlord, no, you don't get to do that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And Valerie, your hand is up.
Unmute myself.
Muted, Valerie, sorry. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I wanted to ask about, you mentioned Section 8 housing. What is going on with Section 8? They're giving out vouchers, but these folks can't find homes or rental units. I've got two people. I don't usually do anything with rentals, but one is an elderly lady, another is a kind of a disabled gentleman, and I can't find them anything. So why give out so many vouchers when the list for the Public Housing Authority is closed, and now you have to go out there to see if you can find it? And people are advertising in Trulia or some of the other that they accept vouchers, but when you call about a specific property, they say, no, we don't take Section 8 housing. Very disturbing.
It is. And this happens around the country, in places where the source of income discrimination laws aren't in effect, and even places where they are and they're not well enforced, or there's no teeth behind the law. And so what happens when you get a voucher, you usually have 60 days to find a unit that you can use it in. And if you can't, you lose it. And so it's often very hard to find units that are affordable for the voucher holder because of what I described about the rent standard and where the landlord will take it. So this is where a local group could have a real impact by working with landlords to talk to them about the program and educate them and dispel all the myths about Section 8 tenants. We've talked to many landlords around the country who prefer to rent to Section 8 tenants because they're more stable, they move less often, they know where their rent's coming from every month, they take care of the properties. So there's a lot of myths out there from landlords who don't want to rent to Section 8, and it takes kind of organizing landlords to get them on board. And then also advocating with the Public Housing Authority around the rent standards, around discrimination policies, and around other administrative policies like the lists that they give to Section 8 tenants of units that will accept their Section 8 voucher. Those lists are often pretty limited. They're usually limited to high poverty neighborhoods. Those lists should be more expansive. The public housing authorities also can change their policies to make it easier for landlords to enroll in the program. Often public housing authorities require a unit to be vacant when it's inspected to be approved to be a Section 8 unit, and their inspections take months. So landlords can't keep their unit vacant for months waiting for it. So the housing authority can expedite that process, can make administrative changes that make it easier for landlords to participate. So these are all ways we can sort of affect the system locally. You have anything else to add?
Yeah, let me add something to that. Frequently, landlords who say they don't accept Section 8 are using it as a pretext for racial discrimination. And the only way you can find out if that's true is with testing. If a landlord says that he won't accept Section 8, a fair housing center can send testers who don't have Section 8, black and white testers, and see if the landlord treats the black and the white applicant for the rental differently, even though neither of them has Section 8. I couldn't keep up with all the chat as it got more intense, but I see that somebody talked about that there's a fair housing center that they described in Louisiana. I don't know if there's a fair housing center in your community, but if there is, I can guarantee you it doesn't have enough funds to do the kind of testing that's required to uncover this kind of pretextual discrimination that Section 8 landlords, that landlords use not to say they're not accepting Section 8. The only way to remedy that, and this is something that the real estate industry can do if it wants to be part of the solution to the problems it created, and that is help to fund these independent fair housing centers so they can engage in the kind of testing programs that will root out not only discriminatory landlords, but discrimination in the sale and rental of the sale of housing as well.
The testing in South Carolina is typically done by the South Carolina Human Affairs Commission.
Well, like I say, I think an independent fair housing center should be doing the testing, and that's the only way to be assured that the testing will be followed up, that the discriminatory landlords and realtors will be prosecuted for violating fair housing laws. I don't know if there's a fair housing center in Charlotte or in Charleston or Greenville or other major cities, but if not, perhaps the Real Estate Association could get in touch with the National Fair Housing Alliance and see how to set one up.
I have a question. I put it in the chat, but I'll ask. Many of our municipalities are allowing increased density with the thought that it would create affordable housing or make housing more affordable. I'd like to get your thoughts on if the increased density is a solution to the problem or is it more problematic in that it's a stress on the infrastructure. And I think something that was pointed out in the book as well with overcrowding in schools.
Well, that seems to me like excuses. People are going to live somewhere. The question is whether they're going to live in segregated, overcrowded neighborhoods, which also places pressure on infrastructure, or whether there are going to be opportunities to live decently. Of course, if you're not going to collect garbage frequently in a low-income neighborhood, that means you're investing less in that infrastructure than you would be if you were collecting it frequently in a higher income neighborhood. If you increase density in more highly resourced neighborhoods, you're going to provide more public services. That's true. But there's no way to, I think, solve this problem without increased density. We can't create the housing that we need. And let me add one other thing. This is something we emphasize in the book as well. There's another myth in this country that is widely shared, and that is that there's some kind of identity between African Americans and poor people. Most African Americans are not poor. They're working class, they're middle class, they have jobs. They cannot afford housing. And the only subsidies we have in this country is for the lowest income families. That helps some, but moderate income families, particularly African Americans, are shut out of the housing market, largely because they don't have the kind of inherited wealth that whites do. And so we always need to be attentive when we're talking about increasing opportunities to provide opportunities for working class, middle class African Americans. And one of the ways to do that is with increased density by building duplexes and triplexes in neighborhoods that are presently single family home neighborhoods. But there's good housing. It's good housing, and it's housing that is presently unavailable to middle class African American families.
Thank you.
Thank-
Just making sure we didn't have any more questions. If anyone does have a question, they can just unmute themselves. Okay.
Kimberly asked, is that the Human Affairs Commission? And yes, it is South Carolina Human Affairs.
Yeah, so I just looked it up. It doesn't look like we have a fair housing group based on, I think SC Housing may do something with testing. I'm gonna have to look into that and see what we can do to support that, even if it's, giving a donation, because as Mr. Rothstein said, it's probably underfunded, these organizations that do this type of work. So maybe we can't be the testers, but maybe we can, give some type of donation to facilitate this being done, or look into something like that. And
Yeah.
Richard,
I'm sorry. The National Fair Housing Alliance coordinates fair housing centers around the country. And if you're interested in trying to see how one can be established in South Carolina or in one of the major cities of South Carolina, the National Fair Housing Alliance, NFHA, is the place to look.
thank you.
I think
I think
Richard
that's-
had a question.
Yeah, I have a question about what is the impact today that happened to service members, military service members returning home back during the wars and not being able to qualify for VA loans. Do you see service members today having some of those same issues?
Well, as I said earlier, there is ongoing discrimination in the real estate industry that I think you all have a opportunity and responsibility to root out. I don't think service members today are discriminated differently from other African American home buyers in the way that service members were discriminated with the GI Bill in earlier decades. But rooting out discrimination generally should be a high priority, and testing is probably the best way to do that. Are you all familiar with that Long Island Newsday?
Yes,
Okay.
definitely.
I don't, I admire all of you, but I don't think that the South Carolina real estate industry there's any reason to believe it's any better than the Long Island real estate industry. I think that goes on everywhere. and it needs to be rooted out.
I would agree. I think we're all human. And there are probably some people that are more human than others. So it's the nicest way I know how to put that. I thank both of you so much for your time and sharing with us. I would like to mention, I caught a couple of resources that you gave. One was the Redress Movement, which is redressmovement.org, and then the National Fair Housing Allowance. So if you all will remember those resources, utilize them in your business, and how we can. Go ahead, Leah.
Can I just add one
Yes.
more resource? Sorry. For more information about land trusts, there's a group called Grounded Solutions that has a lot of information about like toolkits for starting, expanding.
Okay, for land trust.
Mhm.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has enjoyed their lunch and the review of The Color of Law. This has been a great opportunity for us. I think it opened a lot of eyes. It's a wonderful start to a conversation that we need to continue. Lee, Just Action, is that available for people to purchase and read now?
Not
So,
Not now, it'll be released on June 1st, but you can order it now, and I put the website in the chat, but it's easy to remember. It's www.justactionbook, one word, justactionbook.org. And if you go to that site, you can see where you can order the book. It also gives a list of presentations that Leah and I are giving. One is going to be, I don't think it's on the website yet, but we're going to be in Charlotte, North Carolina on June 12th, giving a live presentation. And certainly if you're in the Rock Hill area or anywhere near there, you should feel free to attend.
Ah,
yes. And we're
What-
also, as part of our contract with these wonderful authors, we are going to be buying several copies of Just Action, and we'll be giving them out to our membership. So stay tuned for that.
awesome. Lee and Richard, do you have any last words before we end?
Just thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you. It was our honor and privilege to have you here.
Thank you for having us, and thanks for being in this conversation.